Okay, I'm Van Butsic. Thank you all for being here. And I feel like this is a topic, fire, floods, and droughts, that barely needs any introduction at all. If you've lived in California over the last 10 years, this has been your life, right? So I arrived in California in 2013 to start my appointment at Berkeley. Almost immediately, I started working with PPIC on a project looking at forestry and drought. Little did we know at the time that the drought would continue for another 3 years and end up being the largest drought in California history. And then the fire started. 2017, we had the largest fire in California history, the Thomas Fire. The next year, that was beat by the Mendocino Fire. We had the most destructive fire in California history in 2017, the Tubbs Fire, and that was also beat the next year by the Camp Fire. We haven't had the once-in-a-century flood since I've been here, luckily. So I asked my colleague, Jeff Mount, what should I say about floods? And he got this sort of evil smile. And he said, oh, just tell him this. The once-in-a-century flood, 1860-style flood, will cause $800 billion worth of damage. And here's the real kicker. We are more likely than not to experience that flood by mid-century. So, what are we going to do? I don't think we want to leave California. We all love it here. But we need to figure out how to address these issues around fire, floods, and drought, and especially considering our water system. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I have a great panel here. I'm looking forward to this discussion. How it's going to work is we're going to do 2 rounds of questions where I ask the question and our panelists respond. Then we'll do one sort of lightning round. And then for the last 20 or 30 minutes, we'll turn it over to the audience to hear what you guys have to say. I'm not going to go through the full bio right now. They're in your programs. If you're watching at home online, they're also there. But I will do a quick introduction. So we have Andy Fecko from the Placer County Water Agency. We have Tim Ramirez from the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. Joone Lopez from the Moulton Niguel Water District, and Michael Thompson from Sonoma Water. So Andy, we're going to start with you. Your district has experienced the fires. You had a big fire in 2014. What have you learned, and how are you changing the way you work with these forests to ensure water for your district?
So, excellent question. Thanks, PPIC, for the invite to talk about this today. The King Fire, which was in 2014, which actually seems like a lifetime ago, really, I think for us, but other water districts in the state, was a wake-up call in sort of areas of responsibility, I think. When you're a water district and you're a hydroelectric operator, you think about what you do best, your core mission, and you think it's delivering clean water to people. You think it's producing electricity for the California energy grid. And when you have a disaster like the King Fire in your watershed, what it does is sort of forces you to question what your zone of responsibility actually is. And I think what we figured out was that, when we looked at the history of forest management in the American River watershed, we spent about 75 or 80 years doing pretty intensive logging, which had a lot of detrimental effects to water agencies like ours, right? We didn't realize that we were putting a lot of sediment into the streams, that we had a lot of detrimental effects to the watershed, to the species that call that watershed home. And when we finally did realize that, sort of the early to mid-1980s, the response was we stopped doing anything. And for about the last 30 years, we've gone completely the other direction, and we've sort of taken on a preservationist mindset and a no-touch sort of mindset about our watershed. And what we experienced in the King Fire and what other watersheds have experienced is really the direct result of sort of going too far in the other direction. And the reason I say that is because those past logging practices led to a condition in the watershed that allowed far higher densities. And when you combine the far higher densities of trees with our active fire suppression regime in California, which is to put every fire out, it led to this unsustainable condition that we are currently living in. And so what we learned was that there is a middle ground. there. And working with our partners, what we figured out is that water agencies have a role, not just as a stakeholder, but I think as a partner in preparing our forests for not only the current climate that we live in and trying to get them back to a situation where they can accept a more natural fire regime, for instance, but also we have a role in planning what we want our forests and watersheds to look like 50 or 100 years from now. And again, it's not just as a stakeholder, but as a partner. Excellent.
Thank you. Tim, you're at ground zero for this future massive flood. Also, I've been told that you have one of the most innovative flood protection plans in the state. And a question is, how do you balance within those plans the need for sort of hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure? And how do you look at that when you're thinking about protecting your communities?
So hard versus soft. Let me start by just backing it for a quick second. When you're talking about your own background, I was thinking about how I've been in California all my life, born and raised, Northern California now, Southern California. And the last 2 weeks in particular, I live in the Bay Area. I don't know that I've ever has felt as unsettled, this time with the fires. But it seems to come more quickly and in various forms, flood fires and droughts and lions, tigers, and bears. So I'm going to try to answer your question in the context of the San Joaquin Valley, because I think that's maybe where the risk is the greatest. I was working for a small nonprofit in 1997 in January, for folks that recall that time. And Turlock and Modesto, who run New Don Pedro on the Tuolumne River, made some phone calls and said they're going to open their spillway gates and water's going to come over their OG weir, neither of which had ever happened in the history of the dam before. And a few of us decided it was worth trying to get out and observe, and so we drove around, and it was a very hard place to get to in the middle of a flood. A lot of highways were closed. A lot of the valley on the way was underwater already. And in the aftermath of all that, a lot of good things happened. There were a lot of interest from landowners downstream to have easements placed on their land where they had tried to farm for decades, unsuccessfully to some extent. But in general, to try to expand the river corridor and to make the floodways larger. And that happened to a certain extent. But in the grand scheme of things, we ran out of money. There wasn't enough resources to go around to fill all the interest there was to make those things happen. Fast forward to where we are now with what used to be the State Reclamation Board reincarnated as the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, new legislation, a new name, some new authorities, a formal process to appoint members, and the requirement to have a plan. And the plan's great, but the plan is just that. It's not really going to make change all by itself. And there isn't a lot that's different from 22 years ago on the San Joaquin side. Not hard infrastructure. Maybe some soft things around the edges, but there's room for lots of improvement. But there hasn't been anything really done differently about it. And the San Joaquin River, as I'm sure folks know, and the valley in general, is not plumbed for rainfall events. It's plumbed for snowmelt. The Sacramento side can release orders of more water downstream when they need to than we can on the San Joaquin side. The Tuolumne, the Stanislaus, and the Merced, the San Joaquin proper, these are gigantic river systems. And the downstream capacities, all of them, are less than 10,000 CFS. Think of the American River and over 100,000 CFS coming roaring down safely through town. We can't do that on the San Joaquin side. And that's still the same. And so when this event happens, we're going to have all the same problems. And there are a lot of things that have changed, not from an infrastructure standpoint or soft. A lot more people live there now. And they've crowded around, especially at the bottom end near Stockton, and it's a big problem.
I can't quite leave it there. So one thing that needs to happen to make this better.
So, thank you for asking that question. I was trying to be a little overly dramatic. But it's hard to be overly dramatic about the situation. I don't live there, but I'm concerned about the people that do. I'm thinking of the fires in particular, and if you look at the fire maps from the Kincaid fire, and Sonoma folks have lived this more closely than I have. I have colleagues that are landowners, public agencies there. And you look at the evacuation map that came out, that was different than what happened in the previous years with fires. Like, there was a plan, and it was implemented, and people left because it was the right thing to do. It was safe. On the flood side, forecasting, getting people to high ground, having a plan, that's the best thing we can do in the near term. That could happen now. People could make those plans. Changing the infrastructure takes a lot more time. And the quickest thing we can probably do is to make the floodway corridors larger. Anything else that needs to be done is going to take a long time. But if you drive over, how many folks took the Yolo bypass to get to town this morning? I did, right? You come across the bypass and it just keeps going and going and going. You're like, oh my God, when am I going to decide? And when you drive over the San Joaquin River on the transition from Highway 120 to Highway 5, you can hold your feet up and it takes about 2 seconds to drive over the San Joaquin River. That's it. That's it right there. And if you blink, literally, you miss it. There's just not enough space for the river systems on the San Joaquin. So making more would be a huge improvement.
Thank you. Joone, moving from the fast disaster to the slow one, the drought, your agency made it through the last large drought. And what have you learned, and what are you going to be more prepared for next time around?
Sure. So first of all, thank you to PPIC and all the people who made today possible and inviting us to share our experience and story. And I don't know if many of you know about Moulton Niguel Water District, but just as a context, we serve 6 cities in South Orange County. We provide water and waste service to 170,000 people. And the historic drought was, this is my opinion, one of the best things that's ever happened to our agency, and I think to our industry, because it required change and unprecedented action in a very rapid way, which we're not accustomed to. But I think it really pushed the envelope for us and prepared us better for future uncertainties. Now, you painted a sort of a negative but very realistic picture. And our story is about how you can, regardless of the size of your agency, be better prepared by learning from past crises. And we look at this historic drought, and one of the things that we learned was, over the years, we've been very efficient with our water reuse. In our service area, 100% of our water is met with imported water. And so over the years, we did a lot of programs for conservation, efficiency, 25% of our water needs are met with recycled water. So we thought we were doing a lot, but then we were mandated to reduce 20%. And we thought, can we do it? But we had to, so we pushed ourselves. And one of the things that we realized was there's a far more opportunity for demand management effort than we thought was possible. Just to give you an idea, in our service area alone, we removed 5 million square feet of turf. That represented 25% of all turf that was removed in the county. And our population represents 5%. And even though we removed that much, it only represents 1% of all the outdoor landscape. Now, we're not saying you have to remove all the turf, but it just shows you the magnitude of opportunities to do transformative measures and programs for outdoor landscape where we know most of the water is being used. The other thing that we learned is we need better data. And one of the lessons that we learned year after year is as we get mandates and legislation, it's sort of based on the best information that we had. But when it comes to data, there were a lot of gaps. So we started an effort. It's a very grassroots effort, and it's called the California Data Collaborative. And we thought, how can we apply big data to solve water issues and face future challenges? Because we know that the world is changing. The volume, the variety, and the speed of data is unprecedented. And we see people like Amazon and Netflix making a lot of money from having a lot of data about what we like, what we do. And so how might we apply that to the water industry? So that was really the heart of this effort, is to get better data for better decision-making and better future mandates and policies. And a little after 4 years later, now we represent 21 million Californians as a nonprofit. So having better data allows you to right-size infrastructure, new supply project, because you can better understand demand and what you're going to need to supply and be able to evaluate that. But it also created an opportunity to talk to other sectors, not just water community, but the academic sector, the private sector, NGOs, environmental groups that really wanted to be part of the solution. But they just couldn't understand the raw data that we had that were messy all over the place. By standardizing it and putting it in a centralized location, we can all share it, make it more transparent and meaningful. And that was really important because one of the other things that we learned was customer engagement. Engagement in general. It's not just outreach, it's not just one-way communication, but getting them involved. And so we were able to use some of this data about their usage patterns and using technology like advanced meter infrastructure and customer portals online and apps on their phone to where the customers became an active partner. And they want to do the right thing. And even though the emergency drought regulation were lifted, in our service area, when we look at since we've been around, last year was the lowest water usage on history. And our population, of course, has continued to climb. And we have not seen a rebound because the customers, the public, became active partners and they kept the effort going. And that's really how we prepare for the future, is we need more partners. And I'm really big on that because as a water community, we've done a great job and we do a great job. But there are other things that's happening around us, and the more we can involve those perspectives, all these different sectors, we think that there's not that much in common. But just to give you an example, we did a lot of work with the Building Industry Association, because during the drought, there was a lot of talk about moratorium. Well, a lot of our cities don't want that because that hurts the economic health. So we work with the cities and the building industry to, one, provide the right message, accurate message, but also to come up with creative solutions like demand offset fees and other things that could allow for prosperity, but still make sure that we were being efficient and wise in our water use. So I think as we go into the future, having more partners, diverse partners involved, is really the way you get the best minds together to figure out how we stay resilient and safe as we face fires and floods and all these things, because, like Tim said, you need a plan. And this plan requires multiple industries and people to make that success.
Thank you so much. Michael, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
I guess can you just give us an update? I mean, what's going on in Sonoma right now? What would it look like if you were in the office today?
That's a really good question. Well, first of all, I think I want to start, if I can, with a confession and express some gratitude that I received an email a couple weeks ago about this panel, and we've been busy for the last 2 weeks, and I really didn't get a chance to look at the email till yesterday. And I was thinking, okay, do I have to have a PowerPoint? I have to do some presentation. I don't have time for it. Then I looked at it. It's like, oh, great. This is the panel. Oh, great. I can actually talk on this. So thank you. So that's my confession, and that's my thank you. So the last 2 weeks have been very interesting. You heard earlier where I just can't credit our board and our public safety leadership for evacuating us like they did. One of the groups that had to be evacuated actually was the Sonoma County Water Agency. We had our emergency operations center open. Honestly, the days are blurring together. It was 2 Saturdays ago, I think. And we got word, we were about 100 yards from the mandatory evacuation area in our operations center and our emergency operations center. And then, so we'd been making plans, what if we get evacuated, where are we gonna go? So we started making phone calls and started putting contingency plans in place, which we already had some in place, but then we got the call at 6 o'clock on Saturday night that we had to evacuate. So within the next 4 hours, we were able to relocate. I was able to talk to a friend of mine at the city of Rohnert Park who's the city manager. He said, you can come down. So we set up a new emergency operations center in the city of Rohnert Park's city council chambers. We transferred our operations center to another one of our facilities, which we had provisions to do already years before. But we had to make a 4 or 5 hour scramble we pulled out all of our computer servers. We went into our document files, and we had essentially the core brain or like institutional memory that's stored electronically and in paper file was stored in 12 vans in the city of Rohnert Park's courtyard. And so we evacuated down to there and ran our operations out of that system, out of that center until a Thursday a couple weeks ago. And then, so we were able to go back home. Things were calming down. And then I got a call that night to run the reentry centers for the people returning to their homes. So I've been doing that for the last few days. And it's been interesting. Having been through a couple of fires, I'll describe it from the from many of my best friends lost homes and from this last experience. And there's I guess a journey is the best way I would put it that I see people going through. This past weekend, as we were opening or manning these reentry centers, we would have people coming up who had lost their homes, and the first instinct or the first comments we have is that, we're good, we're safe, we're alive, and everything else was just stuff. But we got out well. And this one woman who I spoke to, she had everything ready to go. She knew she was, potentially in the path. She had all of her records ready, all in binders, all in a to-go bag, and when the policeman knocked on her door, she grabbed her checkbook and left. And that's what happens. I mean, it's when you're in that moment, it's extremely, almost impossible for people to like access that part of the brain we find. But again, it's interesting though. The first thing that people just relieved, it was just stuff. But then I have other really good friends, and I don't know if any of you if you haven't read it, it's really worth a read. It's called The Fire Story by Brian Fees. Has anyone heard? I don't know if anyone's seen or heard of that. But if you have a chance, just Google it. They're actually, Brian and Karen are good friends of mine. And in the time that followed, Karen and another friend of mine, Ann, who lost their homes, when we would get together, they have these moments of where they're things they call used to haves, where they're looking for something, a pair of shoes, or this kitchen instrument or something, and they always have to correct themselves, realize, yeah, that was a used to have. I don't have that anymore. And what we're hearing is that stuff that everyone thought it was just stuff, it actually was more than stuff. It was their habitat. It was the things that made you feel home. And so folks are, I think, challenging with that. And as people are moving back into their homes, they said it really doesn't magically make it all better. I think these events are really woven into the fabric of each individual and of each person. But as a community, I think the one thing we try to do is to provide friendship, provide love, to provide care, and to be a community. And I think all these events really bring communities together, and I'm really proud of ours. It's done really well. But so anyways, I don't know if that's
That was absolutely
Okay.
perfect. Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. And, that's actually a really nice segue to my next question, which I'm going to open up to anybody. Andy, I was going to ask you first, but be happy for anybody else to jump in as well, which is, what are the things we can do that don't take money? The community, these types of issues that can help solve the issues around fire, floods, and droughts. In your community, Andy, what have you seen that we can do without money from the state or money from the local governments?
Yeah, boy, that's a tough question because all these problems are really at their root, in some sense, funding problems. But some of it, some of it's policy, and I think we've done a pretty good job on preparing ourselves, at least from a watershed perspective, at the state and federal level, with pretty good policy. A lot of it's untested right now, right? We're sort of feeling our way through it. This is organic, right? When you have a big change in sort of outlook, you do the policy things, but then trying to feel your way through actually enacting that policy on the ground is kind of the stage we're at with watershed policy, right? The realization that watersheds are a common resource and that it's not just, so for instance, California, just federal land and somebody else will worry about it, right? The realization that the state has an interest, the state of California has an interest in healthy watersheds, local agencies have a stake in healthy watersheds. That's sort of starting to permeate the landscape, I think. Putting that into practice is going to be really interesting. But then, the cultural shift, the communication with your citizens, with your local folks, right? It's really hard distinctions. The distinctions between sort of letting a fire that's occurring at sort of the right time of year burn, right? And that you're going to have smoke, right? That's a thing in California when sort of the first written histories of California were written, they're filled with sort of these tales that the Central Valley of California was filled with smoke all summer and all fall. And we've learned as a society that smoke is bad and we're going to eliminate it. And for many sort of different health and welfare reasons, we've stuck to that. And it turns out that we're going to have to reverse that a little bit if we want to get our watersheds back to a healthy state. That's a communication problem. It's going to take decades to sort of reverse that. All of our laws are set up around reducing emissions. And now the argument is, yeah, but some emissions are good. That's a really hard thing, right? And it takes a lot of people rowing together on that. It also, I think the paradigm changed a whole bunch on sort of active forest management, right? Getting out into the woods, because right now you can't go back to the natural fire regime in California. It's impossible. You'll burn down every forest in California. They're not in a shape, they're not in a condition that's ready to accept fire. So getting back to that state is another cultural shift, which everybody wants. Everybody in California, I think, if you ask sort of citizens that recreate in the state of California, that recreate in the Sierras, if you ask them what their ideal forest condition is, they have a picture that comes to their mind, right? And the picture is what they've experienced when they've been out there. But that's really not the right condition in the current state, and it's certainly not the right condition in our view in a future climate state. And so the education around what a healthy watershed looks like, a resilient watershed looks like, is another sort of communication and education challenge. It doesn't require money, it requires a change in thinking. And so, being a part of that or helping that, it's something that we can do with our customers, but I think it takes a concerted effort all the way down to, grade school level, right? That's what it takes. And so, so we hope we can, those are things you can do sort of without money or at low cost. The other stuff, unfortunately, does take a lot of money to do.
Anybody else like to?
Yeah, so in a similar vein, just real quickly, I think when things happen, bad things happen, people learn and you turn corners, and that doesn't cost anything, but it's reactive, it's unfortunate, it's after everything's already taken place. And I think we've had enough of these things happen recently in different places where other people that don't live in those same locations where the real events happen, I think are starting to see that. And it's very similar, I think, with flooding. I think we have to make our case, but also support people locally who are making the case for these things to be different. With all the information we have about hydrology and forecasting and the effect on the snowpack in the High Sierra, there really isn't an argument anymore about what's going to happen. We all think it's going to be different. How different and how we handle it is really the issue now. But it's also, I think, really the people that are on the ground. I mean, we're a state agency, but we do a lot to support the local folks that are really on the front lines. And, from my personal experience growing up in Southern California, it's hard to find the rivers in Southern California, right? They're behind brick walls, they're behind chain link fences, and the LA River is a place you are not supposed to go, right? The Army Corps wants supercritical flow. It's not safe to be there when there's water in the river. And we've turned our back on these systems as natural capital and assets for communities year-round, not just during flood events when they carry high flows, not just during low flow when you can go for a hike, but all the time. And it doesn't take a lot of money for those things to change. And there are people all over the valley that are doing that locally in their communities where they've turned and looked and found something there that strikes a place somewhere, a chord with them, and they want it to be better and they want it to be different. And that's true, I think, up and down the valley. And there's a lot of good things happening now in the LA River. I'm sure folks have been reading about that, but it's hugely expensive now to do anything there because it's just all walled off and extremely valuable economically. And nonetheless, these small communities are raising money and buying land and restoring access and restoring habitats. And we don't have that problem yet in the valley. Not every place. There's still a lot of room for people to make plans and to see change happen. But I think it really starts with the people on the ground locally that want that to happen. And that doesn't cost a lot. I think it just takes our energy and support for their efforts.
So relationship and innovative thinking doesn't require a lot of money. I think relationship building is so critical because we often think of our community, but very rarely do people born in one area stay there and pass away there. We all move around, and that's why you never know where you might be or where your children or your grandchildren or your loved ones or your friends, where they might end up. So having the sense of connectivity and the broader sense of community and taking the time to build those relationships is really important because when you have that, and you can do that locally, regionally, statewide. Just as an example, for us, every year we do public safety appreciation, We invite all the firefighters, the police officers and deputies that work in our area, because we know when there's an emergency, we're all out there. And getting that familiarity relationship is really, really helpful in coordination. So that's something small thing that you can do, but also building relationship with other agencies, other communities, state agencies, other institutions, other sectors, because this is how you open up your mind and the innovative thinking. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Data for Good Exchange or a coalition called DataKind. There are people out there, incredibly brilliant, with tools that we don't have access to because we can't afford it. But they want to help. They want to do social good. And so we've been able to take advantage of that, as we're not a big agency, we're a medium-sized agency. And one of the things I like to put out there as a little teaser is we partner with Netflix, the movie people, and in 6 months, we saved $20 million. And this all happened because of that network and being innovative in the way that we think about how we serve the public. So those are all the things that don't require money, but certainly things that require time and energy. But it's very worthwhile investment, because what you see the output when you do need the help, or when you do need to be coordinated on messaging, which is so important, that we can all do it together and share resources, so we're not all expending separately, but we can package it together to have a much comprehensive and meaningful message to the public.
Yeah, thanks, June. I think I couldn't agree with you more. A friend of mine once told me, it's really important to make friends before you need friends, and I think that's a lot of what we're hearing. And there is so much you can do that just through essentially relationship building and with local resources. One of the things we're doing that really isn't costing a lot of money, but is already having profound effects on water management in our region, is something called forecast informed reservoir operations, by which our board, our general manager Grant Davis, and chief engineer Jay Jaspers have worked tirelessly through the state and in Washington, D.C., to actually change rule curves on the operations of reservoirs. Many of these rule curves were set in place by Congress in the 1950s, and forecasting has improved a little better since then. We had a case several years ago where, and this was a great example of what we thought might be our climate of the future, where it didn't rain for 50 weeks, then in 2 weeks we got a flood, and then it didn't rain for another 60 weeks. And in that 2 weeks time though, based on the rule curve, we released tens of thousands of acre feet from our reservoirs, because that's what the rule curve said. And so being able to use intelligence, being able to use collaboration to actually make better use and smarter manage these reservoirs using modern forecasting technology, I think is one way to really make a difference. The other thing, and it's an odd collaboration I think we have up in our North Coast, and it comes with regard to, it's just an example of somewhat working smarter. Are actually most entities, I think most areas in the state, it seems like there's a lot of times somewhat of an adversarial relationship, and just the way it's set up with their regulators, with their regional boards. And we have a different one with our regional board. They still do their job, they're good regulators, but we actually partner with them quite a bit. Their executive officer and their board have recognized and said, we're not going to regulate the watershed back into health. We're going to have to do something different. And so we actually work as partners with them in collaborating and identifying ways that are really out of the box to do things better. And it really spoke to what folks said earlier. It's about having that. I do think it's the most important thing we do is have more of a flexible mindset, a growth mindset, that the way we've always done things, I think we've solved all the problems we can solve with the way we've been doing things. We're going to have to think differently to solve problems going forward, which is honestly kind of exciting, and I look forward to it.
So jumping right off of that into thinking differently, if you could convince the governor to think differently about one priority for the governor's water resilience portfolio, what would it be? If you could add one item to that list. This is a 30-second answer, by the way.
Well, I think, taking a cue from the federal government and give everyone rakes, I think. and make America rake again. You know, short of that, I think something that was said earlier, and I think it was said in the opening, which I think is important for us, it's ongoing funding for the collaboration process, ongoing funding for integrated regional water management or sustainability, but just to provide essentially the collaborative infrastructure so different communities can work better together, I think would be absolutely critical. And rakes.
Hard to follow that one. I would say having a mechanism or a body of representation from different parts of California and even sectors to really hold ourselves accountable to what does finally get into the plan and see how we're doing and be able to manage that in an adaptive way and make that a living document that can help us be more and more resilient as we go.
I'm going to try to be more specific, if I can be, from our very good but very general plan we have for Central Valley. The lower San Joaquin, near Stockton, the South Delta, whatever you want to call it, needs a way to convey higher flows. It needs a bypass of some kind. It needs to be done. The state should take a greater effort to lead that charge, and also to integrate it with all the things that are also important to those communities that we know are true. Floodplain habitats for fish, safe drinking water for small communities that don't have that now. There's just a boatload of things that could be done on the San Joaquin side that need to be integrated, and the state can play a real leadership role for that to happen.
So, you know, from a policy standpoint, I think the number one thing we can do as a state is to make our regulators in the state not regulators, but partners. It's a mindset shift in California. Other states have been pretty successful at doing it. I think we're lagging behind in that aspect. And I think it's a no-cost thing, but it takes leadership to take someone who's used to sort of writing rules to sit in a room with you and do joint decision-making. It's a big deal. And I think it would, in all of these areas, make a tremendous difference in moving forward.
Excellent. So at this moment, we will shift to the Q&A with the audience. So we have microphones roving around. If you have a question, just raise your hand and we will try to get to you.
Oh, you'll hold it. Okay, thank you. This is for Mr. Andy Fecko. Regarding fires, PG&E successfully lobbied the California Public Utilities Commission to change the frequency of utility pole replacement from every 50 years to every 775 years. Should that CPUC rule governing PG&E pole replacement be revoked to prevent fires? And what liability does PG&E and the CPUC share for executing such a rule?
So I don't know the specifics of the rule, but sort of just more broadly, we've got a California electric grid that's spread out across our landscape, and that grid is growing to integrate renewable energy and renewable energy portfolios from in-state and from out-of-state. In our view, it's critical that transmission infrastructure, it's critical for the future of this state, for our carbon goals, it's critical for forest health and safety, and it's actually it's a really good opportunity. That grid infrastructure, just like our transportation infrastructure, is an opportunity to build off of, because we have rights of way associated with it, and we can use those rights of way to increase fire-wise landscapes and watersheds and protect communities. I don't look at it as a liability so much. It's a liability right now, but I think it's an opportunity moving forward to use that infrastructure to not only meet our carbon goals, increase that, but also as a community protection tool. And so yeah, I mean, the liability and all that stuff, that's all going to be worked out in court. I don't have a viewpoint on it. I just think it's tremendously important that we think about California's electric grid as, again, a public good.
Okay, another question. We have one here. Oh, right over here. Okay.
Good morning. This could be for any of those on the panel. Where I'm located, I'm part of a collaborative group that deals with forest management. The environmentalists, the timber industry, recreation interests, and local politicians all unanimously support far more aggressive science-based thinning logging, far more prescribed burning. There actually is 100% support for getting those actions done. But as you've mentioned in many issues, a lack of funding with challenging problems is always a hurdle. How do any of you see the strategy being effective of raising public awareness where there is agreement, where there are all the interests working together to try and move forward towards solutions, but there is simply inadequate funding, especially coming from the federal government for Forest Service lands, but even for the private lands that are available? The state has upped the ante, but there's still such a huge gap. How do you see changing public awareness of that need to support treatments where there is agreement?
I'll just start. I think messaging and communication don't always cost money. I think this is where we have to reach out to the media. We saw during the historic drought all this sort of a national and statewide coverage of the issue raised public awareness, and polls show that it was a record height of priority and awareness for the public. So I think reaching out to the media and really educating them and telling them these stories and highlighting some of those areas where there is a lot of agreement can be very helpful. Because we always think about the typical funding stream, whether it's state or federal, but there are other ways that we can raise the funds, in my opinion. One, there are a lot of private foundation and private money that would be interested in funding something like this because of the multi-benefit and what it does for communities and people. It's just that sometimes we have not done a very good job of communicating that, and I think we're getting better. But we really need to hone that message and that storytelling to the right audience. So identifying the audience, knowing what they need to hear, potential funder versus a member of the public versus a media. What are the things that resonate with them? And we can think that through. The other thing is, I think if you can bring the public awareness and if you can help them understand, they're willing to take action and they're willing to pay for it. And we've seen that in our community. Because they know what they're paying for, they're willing to pay the money, even if it's a little extra and above what they're paying for now. And if you can show the comprehensive benefit and the importance of the topic that you're trying to get funding for, that I think that there could be a campaign, a public campaign, to get people to pay for that. And a lot of times when we talk about public financing, getting money from the public, we all get caught up with words like subsidy and all of that stuff. But I think if you can have this coordinated statewide effort on some of those issues where we can all agree, I do think that the public has a desire to contribute.
I said one thing real quickly. This is not going to be an answer, John. I apologize, but it's an observation, and maybe it's worth mentioning. We need to find a way to celebrate operations and maintenance. Right? People are going to give you money to plant a tree. People want to plant trees. They love that idea, but nobody wants to give you money to take them down. Nobody wants to pay for operations of the drinking water plant. Nobody wants to pay for doing work on the levees. It's not as popular. There's not a ribbon to cut. There's not an event to have. And all of us, to some extent, have that same challenge. And it's just, we got to turn that corner. We got to find a way to make it popular, to make it a place people want to go, a thing that is recognized. Awards for our own employees. There's got to be a better way to do this because it's a problem and it's universal, whether you run a hard infrastructure system, electrical grid, a water system, a flood control system, a forest. Those things are hard to get money for.
Yeah, I was just going to, we jokingly always say, there aren't ribbon cuttings for sewer cleaning. and that's the same thing you're just talking about. And it is a challenge, but I agree again with what Joone said, and I would maybe expand that a little bit with regard to the public messaging to look at both messaging to multiple audiences, and always I think back to something I think you said earlier, and it's something we've experienced that about 10 years ago we were delivering about, so just for our wholesale water agency, we were delivering about 65,000, getting upward to 70,000 acre feet of water per year. Now it's 10 years later, we've had a lot of growth in our area, and last year our water deliveries were 40,000 acre feet. And much of that, there were articles I read years ago on, and this is happening with agencies, not just where the drought, but across the U.S., and there was an article that says, where is all the water demand gone? And one of the big areas they pointed to was that they had water education programs that started in the schools 20 years ago, and now these young people that were in kindergarten then are now owning homes, and they're using water differently. And so I think it's both messaging to us, and then it's also, I think it was, you mentioned it earlier, educating the schools, it's part of understanding, having us as a community really understand where we live and how it works. And so that you develop this broad, like deeply ingrained understanding of what our state is and how things work. And I think that it's both an immediate thing, but really taking a lot longer term view of it, I think is going to be important, because we got to where we are over about 100 years of practices. We're not going to get out of it in 10 years. It's probably going to be a long time, and really a mindset shift, not so much, both a change and a deeper understanding.
So let me say about when you have broad stakeholder agreement, right? The best advice I can give on this forest management stuff is, and we had to take it ourselves, is you look at the scale of the problem, and it's like, it's the old thing of trying to eat the elephant, right? And it just looks like there is no possible way that local agencies or local citizens or local stakeholder groups can attack the elephant all at once. And it's true, you can't, right? But what I say is, look, pick 100 acres, the most important 100 acres in your watershed that your stakeholders believe in, and do a project. Be successful on that 100 acres. Gather the money you need, put the time and energy into it, and succeed. That success brings further success, right? And that's how we're going to do this in California. In California's watersheds, we have hundreds of millions of acres. It's state land, it's federal land, it's private land. But right now, we're struggling to find examples of putting together a business plan around that acreage that actually is sustainable, that works, that rebuilds the industries, right, that are absent in California around watershed management. We have a tremendous opportunity right now, back to PG&E story. PG&E has crews from as far away as Florida. I saw some folks from Florida clearing lines, right, the other day. They have men, they have equipment, they have machines. That's all in the state right now. And that's going to last a finite amount of time. And then those guys are going to be freed up. That infrastructure is going to stay in California. I guarantee you, at least a part of it is. And it's going to be available to do the things that you want to do in your watershed. Think about leveraging it. Think about building the capacity now to put those folks to good use when this current PG&E tranche of work is over. I think you can do it.
Excellent. All right here in the front table.
All right, thanks. This is for Michael. First of all, sorry about Sonoma County. I'm a previous resident, but I did watch the fire very closely at Evacuated Family, and I wanted to know, maybe you're still in recovery mode, so not thinking quite, but if that fire would have jumped 101, which I cannot believe it didn't, it would have decimated the lower Russian River watershed. And I'm just wondering, does the county have a plan in place, or did this make you all kind of step back, and what's your plan looking forward? And maybe that's taking some of Andy's advice he just gave, but just curious how you're thinking about that, because that's a very densely forested area, and got very lucky that it didn't burn all the way to the coast.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One, with regard to not jumping 101, again, it was, I think we heard it, we've learned. And when this broke out, we had 5,000, literally 5,000 firefighters in the county. I saw trucks from Washington, Colorado, from everywhere, and the work those gentlemen did and women and to protect us, I just I can't thank them all enough. I'll just tell you, so I learned of this other website called Flight Radar, where you can actually watch the fire, any plane in the sky, where it's going, and I was able to watch how they were attacking the fires, watching the plane patterns. And you saw, I think, some of the super tanker coming out of Sacramento, taking 3 big loops, and all of a sudden a straight line right through Fitch Mountain. And but just the amount of resources that that were delivered to our county. We just can't thank the state and whoever else was involved. Just thank you so much for saving us. With regard to the lower Russian River, that's one of our big fears. That was one of the big lessons that has come out of the 2017 fires. And I know our supervisor, Linda Hopkins, has made this one of her priorities. And I know she is working with many local groups and other land management. One of the biggest challenges we have, though, is that I think it's like 90% of Sonoma County is privately owned. So we don't have these large swaths of federal lands that you can go and do something. So you're really dependent on individual property owners managing their individual parcels. So that's a work in progress, and it's a tough challenge.
So we have time for one more question. You go right here.
Hi. So Joone talked a little bit about big data, and other folks talked about this atmospheric rivers and data there and more information. But those types of things aren't necessarily going to be applicable to the whole state. I mean, atmospheric rivers, that's something that's really important in certain areas, but maybe not others. I'm wondering, maybe this is a leading question, but if we're going to sort of harness big data and we're going to look at unique, different ways of getting information and applying it for a broad use for some of these management decisions, do we need more? Do we have what we need? Is the way that we're collecting data and collecting information and making decisions about forest fires, floods, water supply, all those types of things, do we have the tools and information that we need?
I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet. When you talk about the collection, the reporting, management, and the utilization of data, regardless of what the issue is, we are seeing gaps. And one of the things that I think in California, there's a recognition of that. And a couple of years ago, legislation was passed to really put all water data throughout the state on open platform and to look at how we could streamline and centralize these data so that we don't have redundancy in reporting and we can actually make better use of it. And one of the things that came from that legislation is the establishment of the California Water Data Consortium. And this is very much supported by the administration, the state agencies, and we're trying to get this as a movement to start talking about all the things that you just outlined. Is what are the gaps, what do we have, what don't we have, and what do we need? We know that we have a lot of data, it's just all messy and disorganized. Do we have the talent, the tools, and ways to make that or clean that, standardize it? Not yet. But there are a lot of efforts in different pockets of the state where people are trying. And what we're hoping that is that through this data consortium is that we can harness all those different efforts, bring it in a much more centralized discussion, bring more partners in so that we could start prioritizing and understanding where we are in terms of data so we can better understand what we need to move forward. So I think we are embarking on an effort that's really going to hit at all the things that you've outlined. But right now, we're not there yet because we all know whether you're reporting data or you're collecting data, it is not as streamlined and as effective and efficient as it can be. So I think there's a lot of focus on the data and also making it open and accessible and transparent, which sometimes we like to keep our information to ourselves, and keeping in mind, of course, the privacy and all those kinds of safety measures, but really needing to open up our information so that we can really evaluate not just how our agency is doing, but how we're performing as on a statewide level.
Just real quick, I know that there's always room for more and there's always room for improvement, but the place we're behind now, I think, isn't applying it. It was mentioned earlier about the reservoir rule curves. It's the same in the Central Valley. These are rules that were set decades ago when there was a lot less information. We have a lot more information now that we could use. It's used by the people operating the reservoirs, but it hasn't changed the game. It hasn't changed the way that the reservoirs are actually managed. It changed what happened during a crisis. There's a lot of great data now in lots of places, and a lot more of it is accessible. Even the fire information, it's incredible how much different it is now than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. You can watch what's happening in lots of different ways in real time. Anybody can, and have that information. And what's different about, I think, this time is the way it was applied so quickly by Sonoma County. They learned really quickly, and they applied that, and it made a big difference. And we haven't caught up on the water side, I think, yet, with the structure and how it's required to be used.
Yeah, I mean, so in many respects, we have this tremendous ability to manipulate a lot of data now. But then we do things the way we've always done them in some other areas, right? I mean, we're guilty of this. We have 4 snow courses as an example, and we send guys up once a month to stick a pole in the ground and figure out how much snow is there. And that just seems to me to be a little old-fashioned. When you're trying to manage a system that has a natural tension in California between water supply and flood control, we're always going to have that natural tension in California between water supply and flood control. And as demands go up and as you shrink the same amount of precipitation into fewer and fewer months in the winter, which is our climate future, right? That tension's going to increase. And it seems to me that we've got other tools available to us now, higher tech ways of doing things that allow us to see conditions on the ground in real time. Aerial Snow Observatory, that's just one of the emerging things that we're working on right now, that my agency's working on, I think Sonoma's working on. Those are the kind of things that are growth areas, but I think you're absolutely right. Translating those tools, right, into this sort of naturally very conservative regulatory structure that we have, it takes sort of, in our minds, forever to translate the data into action on the ground, which we sort of know is necessary, but we have this, again, natural conservatism around our rules, and it makes it very, very difficult to sort of make those investments and advancements if we know that we can't use them, right? And so that's the paradigm shift.
Well, with that call to action, I'd like to thank our panelists for being here today.